Hello, everyone, and welcome to the arrival of psychedelics. I'm Dr. Lynne Marie Morski. I am president of the Psychedelic Medicine Association and host of the Plant Medicine Podcast. And I'm very excited to introduce our three panelists for today. We're going to start with Dr. Devon Christie. Dr. Christie is a clinical instructor with the UBC Department of Medicine and a family physician with a focused practice in multidisciplinary pain management. She's also a registered therapeutic counselor emphasizing in relational somatic therapy for trauma resolution and is trained to deliver both MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD through 𝗙𝗵𝗶𝗶 USA and ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. She's a certified mindfulness-based stress reduction teacher from UCSD and is an instructor for the California Institute of Integral Studies Certificate Program in Psychedelic Therapy and Research, the Integrative Psychiatry the Integrative Psychiatry Institute Certificate Program in Psychedelic Assisted Therapy, and the ONCA Foundation Psychedelic Therapy Program. Devon is a principal investigator and study therapist for the current Canadian 𝗪𝗡𝗄s PBC-sponsored 20-participant open-label clinical trial investigating MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. Devon is the medical director with Numinus Wellness Incorporated. She is a recognized speaker and expert on the potential for incorporating psychedelic-assisted therapies in an improved healthcare model for the future. So welcome, Dr. Christie. Next up, we have Dr. Ben Sessa. Dr. Sessa is a consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist who has worked with young people and adults in the field of addictions and trauma-related psychiatry for over 20 years. For the last 15 years, Ben has been at the forefront of psychedelic research in the UK through his affiliations with Bristol University and Imperial College London, alongside Professor David Nutt. He has taken part as a study doctor and as a healthy subject, both receiving and administering MDMA, psilocybin, LSD, DMT, and ketamine in multiple UK research studies. He ran one of the first UK-based medical cannabis prescribing clinics, having written over 500 prescriptions for medical cannabis. Ben is the chief medical officer at Awakn Life Sciences, a company opening Europe's first psychedelic medical clinic, providing psychedelic psychotherapy with ketamine for a wide range of psychiatric conditions. Ben is an approved and registered MDMA and psilocybin therapist. He has led research into MDMA-assisted therapy for alcohol use disorder and continues to carry out research in this area. Ben has been delivering keynote talks at international conferences in the psychedelic community for over 15 years and is also developing psychedelic therapist training courses as a part of his role at Awakn Life Sciences. Ben is the co-founder and former president of Europe's largest psychedelic conference, Breaking Convention. Welcome, Dr. Sessa. And finally, Dr. Darron Smith. Dr. Smith is a faculty member in the Department of Sociology at the University of Memphis. His areas of research and scholarship examine US-based systems of racial oppression and systemic inequality found in all domains across society, including healthcare, the family, transracial adoptions, healthcare disparities, religion, sport, culture, and politics. Dr. Smith's current research and practice intertwine the study of applied neuroscience, race-based trauma, and mental illness by looking at the impact of EEG biofeedback versus MDMA-assisted psychotherapy on brainwave activity in individuals with racial trauma, PTSD, using EEG technology. He is featured in the CBS Sports documentary, The Black 14, Wyoming Football 1969, as well as the Loki Mulholland film on transracial adoption, Black, White, and Us, Love is Not Enough. He's the author of When Race, Religion, and Sports Collide, Black Athletes at BYU and Beyond. Dr. Smith is a member of Chacruna's Racial Equity and Access Committee and is an editorial advisory board member with the Mormon Studies Review. Welcome, Dr. Smith. All right, we've got you all on screen. Fantastic. Thanks for joining us today for this discussion on how we're going to be bringing these medicines into the mainstream medical model, how these are going to be looking going forward. So we're going to start this discussion by focusing a little bit on the past. Dr. Sessa, if you could talk a little bit about the history of psychedelic healthcare and why things went wrong back in the 1950s, and perhaps a little bit about what we must do differently this time. You're on mute, Dr. Sessa.
Pardon me. Yeah, I mean, the history of psychedelic healthcare, if you want to go really far back, then we're going back tens of thousands of years, because there's pretty robust evidence that these medicines have been used in a form of some kind of clinical, clinical, ceremonial, religious, healing, community cohesive sense by doctors, priests, shaman, all rolled into one thing for thousands and thousands of years. So that we can go back that far. There was then a kind of renaissance of psychedelic research in the late 19th century, and then over in the first part of the first 20th century with the isolation and synthesis of mescaline. And then that carried on throughout the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And then, of course, in the late 30s, Albert Hofmann discovered LSD. And there was what's often called the sort of first wave of research, really, that went on then, with LSD and psilocybin really taking the stage. And in fact, I think most people don't realize this, but before the whole drug revolution happened in the 60s, the work done in the 50s and the first part of the 60s was absolutely groundbreaking. It didn't have the controversy that drugs have today. It really was just cutting edge biological psychiatry. LSD was going to be the next big thing. It was kind of becoming popular amongst the psychiatrists around the same time as 𝗙𝗶𝗶𝗶 and some of the early antipsychotics. So there was nothing controversial about it. It was just good biological psychiatry. Then, of course, thousands of papers were written and thousands of patients were seen during that time. Much of the work was LSD for alcoholism, but it was a whole range of things. Then, of course, we have the Dark Ages, which is kind of the 70s and early 80s when LSD was banned, which, as we know, banning things doesn't make them go away. It just makes them, you just hand the franchise to the mafia. So all of the use of drugs all over the world increased hugely, but medical professionals, being good law-abiding people, stopped all their research, but that didn't stop any recreational use. So we have this kind of Dark Ages period, but it wasn't so dark because what we saw during this time was a plethora of once LSD psychotherapists take on MDMA, which was not banned. And so in the late 70s and early 80s, we saw the growth of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. And then, of course, the governments in their wisdom banned MDMA in the mid-80s, which, of course, did absolutely nothing to stop the use of MDMA recreationally, but put a big halt on the research. And then sort of things were a bit quiet for a while, but MAPS in the meantime were grumbling away, setting up, bringing MDMA back to the stage. And I think another big turning point could be, say, in the early 90s with Rick Strassman's study with DMT in healthy volunteers. And then since then, in the last 15, 20 years, we've just seen this huge growth of psychedelic research with all compounds, very little with LSD. People have been favoring psilocybin as a classic psychedelic in research for a number of reasons, but mainly because authorities don't really know what psilocybin is. So it's easier to get it under the bar in terms of ethics. But everyone's terrified of those little letters LSD. So lots of work with psilocybin in terms of classics, and of course, all the work being spearheaded by MAPS for MDMA with PTSD. And then in the last few years, pretty much the topic of today's discussion, we've had this move into the kind of, if you like, medicalization, corporatization, it's a sort of industrialization, isn't it, of psychedelics, which I personally think is really exciting because this is about broadening the opportunities and accessibility to people. It's nice to see psychedelics moving away from the laboratory and moving away from the universities and academic centers into public healthcare systems. And that's what's really exciting about the last few years. So there's a potted history. I'm sure I missed something.
No, that was fantastic. And as a short follow-up, would you like to comment on maybe one or two things that it's crucial for us to keep in mind going forward so that we can stay on the right track and make sure that we don't have, maybe we could benefit more from the knowledge of the past?
Yeah, I mean, I think really important things to do going forward. Some of them are kind of quite contrasting. On the one hand, there is an enormous wealth of evidence and experience in the underground community and in the indigenous communities, and the way in which non-Western uses of psychedelics have been carried out. We can learn an awful lot about that from medicine. And indeed, if you look at modern psychedelic protocols with whatever compound for whatever indication, these concepts of set and setting and a warm, comfortable, quiet setting and a good relationship with the therapist, these are all things that were developed in the 50s in the first wave of research. And so we're still doing those. So that's very important that we hold on to those. On the other hand, we also, in my opinion, need to have a greater emphasis on evidence base and data, because that's the language of the regulatory authorities. The cognitive liberty argument, it's my right to get high, a wonderful ethical argument. I support it 100%, but it doesn't cut the mustard when it comes to getting things over the line with approval agencies. We have to be very, very boring and sober and conservative and get the data in and get these things approved for the betterment of more people. And I think a really important point there for me is we're not going to lose any of. There's some parts of the psychedelic community who are saying, you know, doctors, get your hands off our sacred molecules. I don't think that's true. I don't think we're going to lose any of the sacredness of these molecules, nor will we lose any of the beautiful, rich culture of psychedelics. We'll have both and, not either or. So we'll have regulated, medically driven, safe, efficient, legal, supportive systems for massive access for patients. Plus, we're going to always have raves and festivals and hillsides full of mushrooms.
I love that. Thank you very much. Both and, not either or. A great message to remember going forward. Dr. Christie, I'd love to move now to talking to you about what you see as some of the biggest hurdles in getting primary care providers comfortable with psychedelic medicines, and any suggested solutions you have to overcoming these hurdles.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and to situate myself, as you mentioned, I am a doctor, a family doctor. I'm also a white, cisgendered, heterosexual female, you know, so that's also part of my lens and also part of the lenses that I'm lacking. So I just want to situate myself there and say that I'm here to learn, and that my friends and communities of Black, Indigenous, people of color, I want to do everything to listen and empower those voices, in addition to, you know, the perspectives that I have here to share. You know, barriers to uptake in primary care, I think there's several. There's certainly the stigma that still exists around psychedelic medicines. And there's also the state of the literature, as Dr. Sessa was pointing to. We need more evidence, we need more studies, more data. We're still actually in early phases of data, even though MAPS certainly has published phase 3 data now, which is wonderful and is really leading the way. And we just need to address also knowledge translation and lack of awareness amongst primary care physicians. So to go back to stigma, you know, to me, there's actually a couple areas of stigma that are barriers. The first one being just the stigma around mental illness and prejudice and discrimination that even exists among healthcare providers. We know that PTSD, for example, is often a misdiagnosis among people experiencing post-traumatic symptoms. It's underdiagnosed. And this also disproportionately affects people from communities that have experienced systemic oppression and racism. So really addressing the awareness, the documentation, the asking of the questions of people that are coming in to see doctors in the first place. Maybe they're complaining about a lot of somatic symptoms in their bodies, but really going further to make sure that the people who need help are being recognized as such. And then we talk about the stigma of psychedelics. So as Dr. Sessa was saying, you know, the history of psychedelics and mass criminalization of psychedelics in the last century, stigma can be, I think, more powerful than evidence, even among educated professionals, family doctors. You know, there's this element of emotion that comes with stigma, fear, othering. Perhaps physicians might fear that their social rank or their rank among their colleagues might be impacted if they were to support something related to psychedelics or to provide it to their patients. And really this kind of pressure to remain adherent to norms within a healthcare system, which itself, I would say, is, you know, it's a colonial system. There's a lot of inherent structural violence in our healthcare system. I mean, I'm speaking to Canada, but I think there's similarities to the United States and Europe, westernized systems of healthcare. So there's those structural issues and the stigma around that. So how do we address all these problems? Well, education is one. You know, education is so important. And again, not only around these emerging, very promising psychedelic assisted therapies, but also education around things like cultural intersectionality and biases and how we can actually be serving people, and often people who are suffering the most and need the most support. I think that, you know, it can take about 20 years on average. I think the average is 17 years for an evidence-based intervention to actually get translated and for there to be uptake in clinical practice. So we really need efforts of many stakeholders to assist in a rapid knowledge translation process. That's going to take government, it's going to take industry, it'll take the media and sort of educating all of the public so that all of these various stakeholders can overlap and we have a window of opportunity for a rapid knowledge translation and uptake to happen. I definitely think companies like Numinus Wellness that I'm working with, Awakn that Ben is working with, we're doing our best in these efforts, reaching out. We're a referral-based company. We're currently launching ketamine-assisted therapy programs in Montreal and Vancouver. And for us, it's really reaching out to the primary care physicians in our catchment areas and helping them to understand what we're doing and the off-label use of ketamine and how ketamine might actually be an adjunct to a psychotherapeutic process, not just a drug to be given and taken as a take-home or just sat in an IV chair. And this speaks to, I think, what I think some of the other questions you'll ask the other panelists are going to speak to. But that's the fact that these therapies it's very different. This is an evolution. This is using an adjunctive molecule to assist a psychotherapeutic change process. So I think that's also a big thing that we need to help primary care physicians understand. This isn't just handing out psychedelic drugs to take home, which they may have fears about. This is actually in a very safe, medically monitored setting with trained therapists. So I think those are some of the issues that we face and a couple of the solutions, but really education and stakeholders at the forefront, new guidelines being formed as we get more and more new evidence.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for bringing up what you did at the end about how this is an entirely different paradigm, because that does lead right into what I was going to ask you, Dr. Smith, because the field of psychiatry has become overwhelmingly medicalized with a move away from psychotherapy. Can you talk a little bit about how the field may have to change and adapt as more of these psychedelic therapeutics, which require the bare minimum preparation and integration, but very often require a lot of psychotherapy, become more common?
We'd have to have a complete revolution of the field as we know it, at least in terms of introducing or bringing into the mix these very important Eastern philosophies that we've long sort of poo-pooed, right? And so medicine has never really embraced these things, although they use a lot of the concepts already, but to really a paradigm shift that way in terms of getting people to recognize just how powerful and important these medications can be, these plant medicines can be, and the difference that they make in people who are suffering from any number of disorders, the ones that we've studied. We all know commonly. I've heard some mention MDMA as being one of them, which is one of a very good one by that way. So a very good one, I would argue. So, but I think that in terms of getting the field to move forward on this is going to require science. I mean, I don't know what's happened since the pandemic, but people are just not about science anymore. I don't get it, especially in the U.S. where there's like it's politicized, So we need to do a better job at instilling the importance of science and what science can teach us. Obviously, we have a vaccine. But in saying that, it's going to take a significant shift in thinking and a significant shift in the way that we approach patient care and the way that we work a patient up. And the beauty of it is this, though: we have way more tools in our armamentarium to throw at these conditions that are so debilitating than we had before, because of the advent of this second wave we're riding of psychedelics. And I think if we follow the science, if we recognize what the science is telling us, in particular with these good, wonderful phase 3 FDA clinical trials that are currently underway, we're getting some pretty good data about how effective these medications can be. And so I think that if we show the highly westernized medical community, many of which have a stick up their you know where to open up the coffers of potential understanding, we could make, I think, you know, I don't want to say this, you know, I don't want to be controversial or anything like that, but, you know, potentially maybe a cure. I just want to, I say that very loosely, but I've just seen some of that in my own experience with these substances, and the individuals that I know who are doing studies, we're currently looking at this. The data is just unbelievable. I mean, it really is. And when you're seeing major medical journals publish, you know, these studies in these journals, which you wouldn't have seen that 20 years ago. It would have been unheard of. Now to see these and to see the medical community sort of shift gears a little bit is really quite refreshing. So I know we've talked a lot about physicians in this camp, but don't forget about nurse practitioners. Don't forget about physician assistants and other, you know, advanced practice providers who are also on the front lines doing the same work as well. And I represent them strong. So.
I love it. Thank you, Dr. Smith. By the way, the Psychedelic Medicine Association welcomes physicians, physician's assistant, nurse practitioners, anybody who's a therapist, all of the above. So we are with you, Dr. Smith. We are here to educate.
I love you, Lynne Marie. You know I love you.
Amazing, amazing. I love it. Well, the feeling is mutual. Yes, because anybody who a patient comes to and says, I'm feeling distressed, I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling sad, we need to have everybody across the spectrum be aware of these medicines, not just the, you know, one sector. So thank you for representing nurses, all the above, everybody represented in the PMA, and we need to educate across the board. So as Dr. Smith had mentioned, he called it the second wave, but some are calling it the psychedelic renaissance. Dr. Sessa, can you explain a little bit why we are in this current second wave / renaissance?
So there you go. Yeah. Well, I mean, as I said before, it's probably more like the third or fourth wave if you go back far enough. But we're certainly in this sort of second phase, the second bite of the cherry since it all sort of fell apart in the end of the 60s to some extent. And then we had this hiatus, like I said. So there's a number of reasons why we're in this psychedelic renaissance. First thing I want to say is that that's the title of my book that I wrote over 12 years ago now. And so it's fantastic to see people using that term. Because it's actually been going on for quite a long time. So why have we got this now? I think there are so many good reasons. One is simply time. Young people today, even young politicians today, don't even know who 𝗙𝗵𝗆 was. That name, which was a sort of headline fear factor for so many people a generation ago, just is unheard of, something your granddad knew about. So time itself. Second reason might be that we are revisiting old studies with modern scientific techniques like neuroimaging techniques, fMRI. These kinds of physical techniques are very attractive to approval agencies. It sort of makes it more sciencey than before. So this gives it a bit more of an edge that allows for greater acceptance amongst the approval agencies. Another reason is networking, you know, the internet. There is such a wonderful network now of psychedelic clubs and groups and societies, psychedelic conferences, psychedelic festivals, and the internet plays a huge part in bringing all of that together. So we've got that increased connectivity. Another major reason is what I call patient power. I think that patients themselves they've sat on Prozac for 40 years. They've sat there getting 6 sessions of CBT from a junior therapist on a tick box basis and not getting better. And they're turning to their doctors and their nurses and their other allied health professionals. And they're saying, what else have you got in that drug cabinet of yours? Because this stuff you've had me sitting on for the last 40 years just doesn't work. And so I think there's this real sense of we're in a desperate place in mental health services. We're facing this global epidemic of mental health problems. And there's all kinds of cultural reasons for that. Breakdown of the family, loss of connectivity of communities, etc., etc. And so we're facing this epidemic of psychiatric problems, and our treatments are lousy. And I want to just pick on something that Darren said that's really interesting. I do use the cure word. I use the cure word. I want to be like the orthopedic surgeons. If you go along to an orthopedic surgeon with a broken ankle when you're 15 years old, like I did, they mend it, they fix it, and you never darken their doors again. You are done. You are cured. And why is it that if you go into your psychiatrist or allied health professional in your early 20s now with PTSD or addictions or anxiety-based disorders or depression, why are you still sitting in front of that psychiatrist when you're 60? It's not correct. It's not right. There are no other branches of medicine that would accept these kind of poor outcomes that we seem to accept in psychiatry. And I think one of the problems, just to continue on from what Darren said, is I think that psychiatrists themselves have become learned helpless and are scared of the cure word. We don't even believe we can. We see ourselves as palliative care doctors. We don't think we can cure people. We have to get alongside them for life and just paper over the cracks with daily maintenance drugs that don't cure them, deliver inefficient psychotherapies that most people can't access and don't really work because their trauma is too great and they dissociate and drop out. So we have poor tools, and we've had these poor tools. I mean, psychiatry is only 100 years old, and we've been through psychoanalysis and then behaviorism and then the biological drug revolution. And here we are now. We've got all the tools in front of us, and they are all pretty rubbish. That's the problem. And then comes along a innovative new way, which is actually a very old way, which is the combination of pharmacology with psychotherapy, with a psychospiritual element, in a setting in which the patient is the center, the patient is the boss. First thing I say to every single one of my patients when I meet them is, I work for you. You are my boss. And one of the things that this Psychedelic Renaissance is doing, it's not just a psychedelic renaissance, it's a psychiatric renaissance. We're actually rewriting the whole way we do psychiatry. We're challenging the concept of categorical diagnoses. You know, I've been a psychiatrist 30 years. I've never met a patient with depression or anxiety or personality disorder or eating disorders or addictions or psychosis or schizophrenia. Not one of them. I've met thousands of individual, idiosyncratic clusters of things, all of which are entirely individualized, yet we fit them into boxes with these categorical systems. So that we're in this psychedelic renaissance because the patients want it, the therapists want it, society needs it. The big question is, what do we have to do this time around to not balls it up? And it's really important that we get this going forward. And I really loved what Devon said about just how we need this really well thought through integration of multiple stakeholders and very disparate stakeholders, from the kind of crazy hippie on the street all the way to the people who sit there and sign off new regulations of drugs. All of us have a part to play, because if we don't get it right this time, I don't think society and the world can stand another 50 years of prohibition as we just experienced. So it's so important to get it right. And it's really lovely hearing what Darren and Devon are saying on this.
I know it's not just me. I know that everybody listening to that was just like fist pumping along, and like I got chills when you said I work for you. Thank you for those perspectives. I think you're absolutely right. This is not just a psychedelic renaissance, but a psychiatric mental health renaissance. And I really appreciate how you described everybody and their idiosyncrasies and not necessarily fitting into boxes with our, coding in our medical system. So thank you for that extremely refreshing perspective. Dr. Christie, let's talk a little bit about how, when we're moving into this system, primary care doctors may be thinking, like, are you expecting us to do the psychedelic medicine? And we're saying, no, like, this is going to be a referral system, basically like it is for any other specialty. And at that point, what is it important for the primary care doctors to know, and able to have that communication with the referring specialists?
Well, yeah, it'll be important for the referring primary care physicians to understand what conditions we're treating. So that's going to come through evidence, through outreach. I think, our company, we've developed referral forms with FAQs, and there's a lot of information there that it can be on the service provider, the person receiving the referral, to very clearly outline what are the appropriate referral criteria, at least as an initial screen, so that primary care physicians can feel confident that they're making the right referrals for whatever the indication may be, whether we're talking about once available and regulated MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for post-traumatic stress disorder. In our case, we're talking about ketamine-assisted psychotherapy for depression, and then other indications. But I think that there's just that two-way communication between specialists and referring providers that we always want to make sure is clear, that the information that we need from the primary care provider is included in the referral, such that we can do an appropriate medical and psychiatric screening to determine, if this is indeed an appropriate indication and treatment for this individual. I also think it's important to understand, as both Dr. Sessa and Dr. Smith were talking to, that these are brief interventions. They're meant to be brief interventions. That's how they're being done in the research, which is showing good results and showing robust results, even at 12-month follow-up. So it's not like a drug company doing just a 3 or 4 week follow-up and then that's it, we're done, it works, we're good. MAPS has done 12-month follow-up and no further doses of MDMA in that interim period, and people are actually better than they were at the study exit. That was their phase 2 data. So I think what needs to be understood is this is a brief intervention. It's going to involve stages of preparation, trust building. There's a psychotherapeutic component. There's the actual medicine-assisted sessions themselves, and then there's the integration aspect, and that's going to follow an arc. I think part of appropriate referral is going to make sure that people being referred are already embedded in a network that's supportive to them. Ideally, they've already got a psychologist or a therapist that they're working with that they can kind of be held in the beginning and then return to afterwards. Also, other solutions with Numinus, we have psychedelic harm reduction and integration groups where anyone coming through our programs can also drop into these groups at any stage of their trajectory in their care and receive community support and ongoing support in that kind of format. So the referring providers really just also need to be aware of the existing supports and the supports available for the individuals that they are referring, in addition to potential contraindications, either psychiatrically or psychologically, as well as from the medical perspective.
Thank you very much. Great points for all the primary care docs out there who may be listening. Dr. Smith, I wanted to ask you, how are patients that you are working with who may bring up psychedelic medicines to you, do you know how they're getting their information? And on the flip side, if somebody comes to you and they're unfamiliar with psychedelic medicines, and you think that it may be, for example, ketamine or something else in a different location is something that they could benefit them, how do you broach that conversation? Oh, and mute off. There we go.
So I'm in the South, and it's these kind of conversations are very, very hard to have down here because in this region people are very they're very much into the Bible and religious norms and rules, and so only when they come to you for these, only when they come and ask me for these ideas or what this might mean, I'll put it out there. But generally, I don't hear much discussion about psychedelics in this community. Here in the South, there is a practice. There's a ketamine-assisted practice here. There's a CRNA who's working here. A certified registered nurse anesthetist is working in the area who's doing ketamine-assisted therapy. But other than that, there's really been a whole lot of talk about it in this community. So I'm trying to build some momentum here because eventually here in the States we'll be faced with at least in some form, at least psilocybin, if not MDMA, coming online in at least 3 years. So if that's the case, there's going to have to be some real serious education. I like what Devon was saying, and I just, Devon, are you having much success with what you're doing in your region with primary care providers? Are you finding out that they receptive to the message of the psychedelics is on the horizon, or what has been your experience? Because here it's been quite the opposite here.
Yeah, it's mixed, and it's certainly, I've been in the field for over 10 years now here in Vancouver, and I've absolutely seen a growing momentum and the formation of the Canadian Psychedelic Association, and more of my colleagues signing up because they're curious. And so you sort of get the people that are open. Trait openness is something that psychedelics increase, and I think that people attracted to them in the first place exhibit as far as their personality structure. So these open physicians are definitely coming out of the woodwork and joining and learning and listening to the different academic presentations that different organizations are offering. I still think, though, in sort of a broad blanket sense, there's still a lot of unawareness amongst, your general family physician. And I think maybe they may have heard a few things about psychedelic assisted therapies, but they're kind of aware that those things aren't approved yet. So it's way off in the future. And so there's still, and in a sense, that's true. And in a sense, we do have time actually to be doing these educational campaigns and really generating awareness about not just the existence of these therapeutics, but as Ben was speaking to, Dr. Sessa, around just the whole shift and the whole paradigm shift and how we need to be thinking about mental illness from a different perspective and really looking at the roots of these conditions, the roots in early childhood, disconnect, relational deprivation, neglect, poverty, social determinants of health that are all impacting a developing brain and a person's ability to regulate themselves, and this, which all sets up the vulnerability for the emergence of what we are now calling depression, PTSD, eating disorders, all these different categories. So, and this is the beauty of psychedelics and psychedelic assisted psychotherapy and how they're working in the brain and how they work with psychotherapies. We can actually drill in to start to heal and address, and this is why we're talking curative intent, the relational deprivation that happened then. We have neuroplasticity. We can have a very healing and healthy therapeutic environment with trusted therapists where all of those ruptures that happened so long ago and contributed to the emergence of mental illness can be healed in the setting of well-trained therapists who are extremely attuned with the needs of their patients, participants, people who are seeking their care. So I went on a bit of a tangent. I'll stop there, but yeah.
I appreciate
paradigm
that.
shift.
We have a lot of work to do down here legislatively as well, in terms of educating legislators about this, who are the gatekeepers to getting any policy pushed in the community, whether it be public health, whether it be public works. So utilizing those avenues, and also really trying to, at least at this point, beef up the information about ketamine and the ability that ketamine has to do some of this important work as well. I think I was talking to some of you earlier before we went live about the use of ketamine with neurofeedback therapy, for instance, and what I'm seeing with that. Really interesting, in terms of what I'm seeing case by case, is more stability in the brain, more stability in functional networks that are responsible for much of what you just said a few minutes ago, Devon, about the importance of we call it 𝗙𝗍𝗋𝗄s. The 𝗙𝗍𝗋s. I don't know if you've ever heard much about the 𝗙𝗍𝗋s. Childhood traumas that we all have been exposed to some extent, right? We all have had some experience with that, and whether or not we seroconvert, if you will, into a full-blown mental health disorder has a lot to do with our natural coping factors that we have. We have to consider that as well. But yes, in general, here where I am, we have work to do, a lot of work to do, sadly.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you sharing that, Dr. Smith, and for your contribution, Dr. Christie. Dr. Smith, it is my personal dream that at some point in time it will be malpractice not to tell your patients about psychedelics, regardless of area of the country. So let's all keep that, we will, well, and actually what you were talking about with the fact that access may be different in different areas of the country / world leads us right into what I think will be our last question, because we have about 5 minutes left. But Dr. Sessa, if you could address my favorite topic, how can we increase accessibility for everyone? How can we move toward free public health psychedelics so that these medicines don't end up available only to the wealthy and privileged?
What we first do is make sure we unmute ourselves. Through all of the channels that we've talked about, through good science, through good public health, psychoeducation, through the young people, through disseminating the word, through conferences and talks, I find that the young people are much more receptive than the old. I recently got vetoed from speaking at a local event because of one old crusty psychiatrist, and then over 100 young people all signed up to turn up. So this one person was very much put on the spot as really not being with it. So we have to disseminate the science, because, like it or not, that's what the approval people need. They don't really care about whether or not something's got 5,000 years of indigenous use history. It doesn't mean a thing to people who are making drug approval decisions. It ought to, perhaps, but it doesn't. The MHRA, the FDA, the EMA, they don't see psilocybin as any different from penicillin. And in some ways, nor should they. It's a drug. You have to jump through the hoops. You have to do your phase 1, 2, 3 studies. It's different for psychedelics than they are for anything else. And then what a lot of people don't like, these words like corporatization and medicalization. But the truth is, public healthcare
technical difficulties there.
Vision is can you not hear me?
No, damn it, Ben. Rewind and start again.
You're a little bit cosmic.
It's just your internet signal, I think, Ben.
Yeah, I think so.
Are you back?
Come on back.
Oh, me?
We can hear you.
Cool. Yeah, the truth is that public healthcare delivery is expensive and time-consuming, and you have to do it through regulatory agencies. You can't just do it on the back of an envelope because that's what we think we'd like to do. So it requires money, and that requires investment, and that requires investors, and it requires banks, and it requires corporations, and it requires pharmaceutical industry and government partnerships. And this is what's so important. And I think some parts of the psychedelic community are just terrified of all those words. But the bottom line is, if we don't work with those things, these magic medicines will just stay magically banned forever. And we can't have that. So we have to work with all of these mechanisms. So at Awakn Life Sciences, what we're doing is we're providing both development and delivery. And the idea is to be the high street presence of psychedelics. So we're not just developing drugs like many other companies are, we're building bricks and mortar clinics, and we're going to be the place where you can go and get psychedelic therapies. Like Devon said, and Darren said, initially with ketamine, because it's the only one that's available, but it means we've established ourselves as not just a ketamine treatment center, not one of these places, a place where you get psychedelic assisted psychotherapy with ketamine, because that's all we've got. And we hit the ground running in a couple of years when psilocybin and MDMA come online and whatever else is in the pipeline. So it's working with now in the UK. It's like different. We have this thing called the National Health Service. I know that in America you have I think one of the worst health services in the world. It's lower than most third world countries, I understand. But in the UK we have this wonderful National Public Health Service. And this gives us a wonderful opportunity. But the National Health Service will only fund treatments that have guidelines due to all the completed research. So it will be in the realm of private healthcare until we get that public funding. But we will, because the health economic argument for psychedelics is very strong indeed. They absolutely save millions. And that's the way to do this. You talk to your politicians. You don't talk about efficacy. You don't talk about it being the right ethical thing to do. You say, do you want to save hundreds of millions of pounds a year? Oh, right. Let me tell you how you can do that. We're going to use this treatment. Politicians love money. So we really need to push this health economic argument. I think it's a very, very strong argument for us disseminating and increasing the accessibility of psychedelics for public healthcare. It should be free.
Then I want to say thank you for calling out the United States healthcare system, because it is rotten. I really appreciate that. Thank you. And any media people, pick up on that, because it's a very important thing what Ben just said.
Yeah, and I would also just want to echo really quickly. I know we're wrapping here, but I agree with Ben. I mean, it's why I'm aligned with Numinus. We've got shareholders and investors, but they're helping us build something and actually deliver something that we are then going to be advocates for and an example of, and collecting research around to actually push the policymakers on this. You know, so it's in a sense we're filling the gap in between where this is actually going to be taken up into, in Canada, our public healthcare system or universal access, which is administered provincially. We're going to need to petition governments to actually consider these therapies. And the economic argument is absolutely crucial. I think the global health pandemic has showed that the mental health crisis is even worse than it was. The cost to society is enormous. And in our healthcare systems, we've historically prioritized physical illness and physical cures. We spend thousands of dollars all the time, every single day, with people going in and having surgeries to treat their this, that, or the other thing, their gallbladder removed. We need to take away the stigma around mental illness, have adequate and at par funding for mental illness, and then look at these interventions as psychological surgeries that, yes, they're an investment, but they pay off. And if you actually compare them to a person going in for a routine surgery, the costs start to finish, they're probably not that far off. So we just need to change how we're thinking about things.
Preach, Dr. Christie, Dr. Sessa, Dr. Smith. This has been a complete joy to get to facilitate three such passionate minds on this topic. I want to let you, we're wrapping up here. However, this is the time in which everybody clicks on their other link in Pine to go over to the breakout session where you get to ask your questions, and then we will put you on stage to chat one-on-one with our incredible panelists. So we will see you over there.
Thank